you didn't know who I am was really comforting to me, because I used to be in politics, and usually the things that people remember about politics and politicians are things that probably you don't want remembered. So I appreciate that. My name, as you know, is Bud Smith, as you now know anyway, and my role in all of this was I was the last chancellor of the Diocese of Cariboo, and during the time when we wound up the Diocese of Cariboo, Bishop Cruikshank directed me to be the sole contact between what we were doing and the diocese and the government of Canada through the entire process. And why that's important is because the government of Canada was very, very central to this whole exercise that we were in. I'll start from today. Today, Cariboo, the Diocese of Cariboo, in law, exists. Cariboo in reality does not exist. In fact, law professors or people of that sort, or former attorneys general maybe even, would say that Cariboo is functus officio. As of December 31st, 2001, we wound ourselves up. We no longer function. So what does all that mean? In 1914, as the population here was growing, the European population here was growing, people wanted their own diocese. They wanted to be able to operate their own church. And so the legislature of British Columbia created, by legislation, the Diocese of Cariboo, and they created it out of the Diocese of New Westminster. So they reduced the size of the Diocese of New Westminster and created the Diocese of Cariboo in 1914. When we went through the process of winding up the Diocese of Cariboo, I went to the then Premier of British Columbia, that was in 2001, 2002 time frame, and asked that at the point of our winding up, that the government introduce legislation through a little process called the Attorney General's Amendment Act, where they put in a whole potpourri of things they want to do that don't require a whole single standalone act. I asked that the government rescind the legislation that had created the Diocese of Cariboo so we would be completely wound up in law, because only the legislature can undo what the legislature created. The government declined to do that because of the process of debate in the legislature. The entire dialogue of Indian residential schools likely would have arisen in the BC legislature through the process of winding up Cariboo. And so the government didn't want that to happen because the BC government jurisdictionally had absolutely nothing to do with the residential school process, and they didn't want to therefore import the discussion into the halls of the legislature. So we were not rescinded legislatively, and that means that in law the Diocese of Cariboo exists. So how did we get to today as being the territory? We went from Cariboo to Apsey, the Anglican parishes of the Central Interior, and ultimately to the territory. It all begins, if we look at the big overall picture, it begins with litigation by a man named Mowat, who was sexually abused at the Indian residential school in Lytton and was a parishioner of the church in Lytton, and he sued us and the government of Canada for his abuse. And Canada then also third-partied us. Excuse me. That's a process in law where you say, I may have some liability, but you also have some liability, so I'm going to pull you into the lawsuit. And so Canada pulled us into us and every other church in Canada, to every lawsuit that was ever originated in this whole area. And that increased costs for the church. Why Canada did that is because there was a belief in the halls of Parliament and in the cabinet in Ottawa at that time, in the 1990s, that the churches were singularly responsible for the residential school process and for the abuse that took place there. Hard to believe that Canada actually believed that, because it was Canada, of course, who created the residential schools in the first place and then contracted with the churches to operate them. And we, in my humble opinion, foolishly agreed, and Canada not only had us operate them, but underfunded us completely for the cost of running those schools. Nevertheless, that's what happened. So the cost of the Mowat decision to this diocese was $400,000 for the judgment, plus all the legal costs. And there were more suits coming, and the legal costs were mounting, and if those kind of judgments were rendered, there was no possibility we were ever going to be able to get out from under paying for them. And the political agenda at the time in Ottawa, as I say, was that the Justice Department wanted to lay all of the cost onto the churches because they believed that it was ours. And throughout this process, one of the things that took place was Justice Canada began asking us, me, for a list of all our assets. And some of the things they asked were the obvious things, our lands, our buildings, but they also asked for the value of the bishop's crucifer, for silverware that we use during communion, for the value of our furnishings, stained glass windows, and pretty much anything you could imagine, they asked for the value. So we had a lot of discussions about this. We being the church council, the bishop and I, and I came to the conclusion that we were going to have to make what was going on public. And there was a lot of resistance to that within our church hierarchy. But one day, I was phoned by a person from the National Post who had heard about this activity going on and asked me if it happened. And rather than say no comment, I told the reporter precisely what had happened and was happening. As you can imagine, that was not welcome news in Ottawa. And I got a lot of phone calls and a lot of memos, which I still have copies of, that were pretty harsh because I had bothered to tell the public the truth. And so I sat down with Bishop Jim and I said, look, in my experience in politics, there is not a snowball's chance in Hades that a government will want to own a church. So I think what we should do is call their bluff. So I had Bishop Jim sign documents of transfer for all our churches in all our parishes in this diocese, and I took them to Vancouver to the director of Justice Canada, and I laid them out on the table, and I said, you want our churches, you keep talking about the bishop's crucifer and the value of other assets we have, and we don't like it, and we're not going to put up with it anymore. So if you want these churches, they are yours. Here are the transfers. All we ask is that you give us back a lease for $1 a year, and we'll keep them in good shape, and we'll operate them until such time as you've been able to go to City Hall and all the communities and get a demolition permit or a rezoning application done to convert them into condominiums or whatever you're going to do to sell them. He said, we don't want your churches. I said, well, you wouldn't get that impression by your public statements. So I'll tell you what's going to happen. You are going to get our churches if you keep this up. And the next time I visit you, these documents, these transfers, will be in registrable form for the Land Titles Office, and I will have with me a man named Clem Chappell, who used to be the lead political reporter for what is now Global Television. He will accompany me, and I will give them to you. And he said, don't you ever dare do that. And I said, I will dare do that. In fact, will do it if this keeps up. And he assured me it wouldn't happen any longer, and in fact it didn't. So that gave us the opportunity then to start dealing with the issue internally the best way that we knew how, that we could, without that kind of interference coming at us from the Government of Canada. So inside Cariboo at that time, what were we doing? The clergy, Bishop Jim, the Metropolitan, who was Bishop Crawley, and who was also the acting primate at that time, which was helpful to us as we went along, all concluded that Cariboo could not carry this load on its own, and that the diocese was going to have to make some choices. Choices might be whether the diocese merged with another diocese, or whether it wound itself up, and if it wound itself up, what would happen? So there was a lot of dialogue within our diocese, and it led ultimately to the choice that was made, which is that we would wind up Cariboo through bankruptcy if needed. And that was a major, major decision. No church ever in our Anglican communion in the world has gone bankrupt. And so we let that be known, and we proceeded then along the path that we did. And just anecdotally, when on 9/11 actually, I was in an ecumenical meeting south of Ottawa with the United Church, the Roman Catholic Church, Presbyterian, and others, and representatives of Justice Canada talking about where we were going, because by that time we had in fact wound up. And the head of the Catholic bishops of Canada came to me and said, I would like through you to your diocese to thank you for the courageous position that you have taken throughout and for what you have done in winding up. I'm not happy that you did, but I have to thank you that you did. And the reason is I have been phoning and communicating with Prime Minister Ketchan now for 6 years, telling him that if this carried on, there would be dioceses in Quebec that would have to go bankrupt. And he laughed at me. And after you announced your winding up, about 2 days later, I got a phone call from the Prime Minister asking that we come and sit down and begin to talk. And he said, there is no doubt in my mind that I got that phone call because of what you did in the Diocese of Cariboo. So this is not something that was just us alone. It was going on, but we were the pointy end of the spear and the lead cow, I like to call it. And we were the ones who were out there on the front lines trying to figure out our way. So there was no precedent for this. It never happened anywhere else in the world. And we began to meet with the parishes. We had made a decision that we're going to go through a process that would bring us to an end, or bring the Cariboo to an end. And so we went and met with the parishes. And we, largely, was me. I went to every parish at least 3 times. One, to outline our challenge. And it was always a meeting like this after the service and after coffee, a meet and lay out the challenge that we were having. Secondly, to raise winding Cariboo as an option, that we were going to go this way, and what it meant for each parish, for the diocese to go bankrupt, and to seek feedback on that, because it was kind of shocking to people when they would hear that, and to seek their feedback and how they might approach that, or how they might respond to that were it to happen. And thirdly, to kind of set the table, if you like, for what was going to take place and what did take place at the synod in Quesnel that did this. So when I say I went 3 times, it wasn't 3 weeks in a row. This happened over probably an 18-month period that we went, and sometimes I'd go back to a parish because they wanted a second meeting to discuss things. So the parish process that we went through affirmed 3 guiding principles, which governed how we conducted ourselves at Quesnel. It has governed how APSI was formed. It, in my view, informs today how we operate as a territory. And those 3 principles were these. 1, and it would be the first thing we would do, is accommodate the will, needs, desires of First Nations people in the territory of the Diocese of Cariboo. And you'll note the word territory is used. I'm reading from the actual guiding principle. It's territory means geography, as you know. Secondly, we would accommodate the will, needs, desires of parishes and worshiping communities within the diocese. And third, we would accommodate the structural needs of the Anglican province of BC and Yukon and the Anglican Church of Canada. Now this was a big deal because the history of our church is that it is top down. The bishop rules in the diocese, period. That was the history and remains the history of our church. But the context of what we were doing also were adopted in the face, those guiding principles, in the face of debate that was ongoing in the Diocese of New Westminster about our church's position around dialogue about sexuality issues that were impacting the broader church, including parishes that wanted to leave their diocese and join with the Bishop of Chile, who was leading and his leadership in South America. So there were a number of, and in fact there was one parish, I think, in the Diocese of New Westminster that in fact did that for a while. I think they've since come back to New Westminster, but they went through that process. So our guiding principles put the larger church leadership needs third. And that was not totally well received by the leaders of our church outside of the Diocese of Cariboo. But we did it. Now, this led us then to the final Cariboo Synod, which took place on between October 13th and 15th, 2000, at Quesnel. It was, there were 17 parishes represented there. It was led brilliantly, in my judgment, by Bishop Jim Cruikshank. It was supported, he was supported by the then Bishop of Kootenay, Metropolitan of the province, and acting primate Crawley. Media was allowed in. How did that happen? Well, the CBC showed up, the National Post showed up, our Anglican Journal showed up, and they wanted to be involved in the process and listen. I suspected they weren't there to get good news, and so there were a lot of people who did not want them to come in. And I said, well, listen, if we keep them out, that, first of all, will be a story. Second of all, the walls in this building that we're in, the church at Quesnel, weren't exactly soundproof, so they're going to hear everything anyway. And so why don't we invite them in? Why don't we simply invite them to come in and be with us on condition that, and they can come to our meals and do it, be the whole program. And they would be invited in on condition that they would not approach anyone for comment unless that person indicated they wanted to be approached. So we didn't want them bothering anybody. They did not have voice, and obviously they didn't have vote in what was going on, but they could come in and observe and record and write whatever they wanted. And there were no television there, it was just radio. So that's what they did. They came in and they were throughout the whole program. The meeting was filled with heartfelt dialogue. It was filled with a huge amount of love for all that people had experienced in their diocese, and most importantly, it was not filled with a single word of recrimination. Because frequently in law, I think almost always in lawsuits, when a lawsuit arises, people blame the person who is suing them for their misfortune or for the stress they're being put through or whatever else. It's not unusual. Frankly, it's natural. It would be surprising if that didn't happen. And there was every possibility that that might happen at our synod. And that is why Bishop Cruikshank had spent so much time and sent me around spending so much time to make sure everyone understood what was going on and why it was going on before we got to the place where we had to make a decision. And as a result of that, as I said, brilliant leadership by Bishop Cruikshank. When we were at that meeting, there wasn't a single word of recrimination at all, not one. And in fact, the media found nothing negative to report. And that I always took as a measure of how successful the meeting was, that for 3 days, national media could be in a room with a group of Anglicans who are not exactly shy about speaking their mind. And people weren't shy about speaking their mind at that synod, but the speaking of their mind was of love and of the future and not of anger and recrimination. And at the end of it, towards the end of it, because I had said throughout that financially the Diocese of Cariboo is toast. We were done. We couldn't carry on any longer. And at the end of it, of our meeting, a delegate from Prince George stood up and said, well, the diocese may be toast financially. I see us here today as being yeast who will build something new. And it was a wonderful way to encapsulate the whole 3 days of what we had done. And following upon what she said, the resolution was called, and it was agreed upon unanimously to wind up the Diocese of Cariboo effective the 31st day of December 2001. Following that, Bishop Jim designed and led a beautiful moving service right here. I think it was in September of 2001. I know it was before I was at that meeting in Ottawa I described early on, which was on September 11, 2001. But he led a service where he laid up his crucifer on the table and other acts to symbolically wind up the Diocese of Cariboo. And it was held here, as I said, before a completely packed sanctuary and overflow into the hall. But spontaneously, near the end of the service, two Indigenous men, both of whom had been sexually abused at the Lytton Residential School, rose wearing traditional dress and walked round through these aisles amongst our congregation, smudging everyone with sweetgrass in an extraordinary act of grace and healing and reconciliation for every one of us who was present. And I think their action affirmed, without any words being spoken, the extraordinary care and humility and openness and kindness which Bishop Jim had led us all during the entire difficult process to bring the Diocese of Cariboo to a conclusion of its Episcopal journey. He was extraordinary throughout that time, and that gesture by those men spoke volumes. So that led us then to APSI, and by the way, these are not all sequentially happening. APSI was being discussed and debated and kind of put together while all the rest of it was going on. What became APSI, it wasn't called APSI in the beginning. APSI being the Anglican parishes of the Central Interior. And during this time, Bishop Crawley, or Archbishop Crawley, I should say, was leading us in establishing what we called a confederation of parishes. I always thought that was a nice Canadian word, confederation of parishes, which we called, as I say, the Anglican parish of the Central Interior, and were so arranged and recognized by the Metropolitan of BC and Yukon to take effect as of January 1, 2001. So there was no delay and there was no gap between our theological journey and our Episcopal journey. APSI also, importantly, I think, adopted the three guiding principles that were associated with the winding up of Cariboo to inform APSI's own governance structure, so that placing the needs of our Indigenous communities first, the parishes second, and the structures of our church third was what APSI adopted as the guiding principle for its own governance. And all of that then was led theologically by a suffragan bishop who was, I think, reported to the Bishop of Kootenay, I believe. But there was a suffragan bishop that led us. And an important component of that governance structure was the creation of the Fraser Basin Property Society. And let me do this, please. The Fraser Basin Property Society was put together to hold titles to our churches, land titles. Because under Cariboo, all the titles to the land and buildings stood in the name of the Bishop of Cariboo, which is pretty consistent with probably every Anglican diocese in the world. And, but as of December 31, 2001, no such bishop was present. And therefore, the titles need to be transferred to be held by somebody, somehow, because the land title system won't allow titles just to kind of hang there in nobody's name. And what we had done during the course of winding up Cariboo and keeping true to the principle that we would put the parishes above the structure is we engaged someone whose name escapes me now. It's a young student, university student, who was a parishioner at Williams Lake. And she went through every record and receipt showing who paid to build all these buildings in the Diocese of Cariboo, including when we were part of the Diocese of New Westminster. And it turns out, I thought when we engaged her to do this that it would be a bit of a gong show for her, but as it turns out, we're really good record keepers. And she was able to get receipts for stuff going back to way back deep into the 1800s. And the only donation that came into the Diocese of Cariboo to build a church had come in from the Church of England, or at least from somewhere in England, to build the church at Quesnel. All the rest of these churches, the funds to build them had been raised by parishioners, by whatever way that we do that, and by taking loans from the foundation or from other places to build. For instance, this place, when this was expanded and a new roof put on it and so on, there was a loan taken out. And all of that was repaid by the church. So there was no money in these churches from the national church or from the province of British Columbia or from anywhere else. All of the equity, as lawyers would call it, in these buildings belonged to the parish. And so because we had done that, and because we had learned that that was the case, and we had consulted, as I said, each parish before we went to the synod in Quesnel, we then put together an entity that would own the title for registration purposes, because I had asked each parish, by the way, if they wanted to incorporate a society and individually own their own land title. And all of them said no. They preferred that there be a common entity that owned the title. Now, this is a little bit technical, but you should know it because your own land titles are this way too. Land titles all have two parts to them. One, the legal title, and two, the equity. And when we take out a mortgage, what we do, the title, if you go to Land Title's office and look, see what the title is, it remains in our name, the legal title. What we give to the bank by way of the mortgage document is the equity in the building. So the title is ours, the equity we pass off to the bank until we repay the loan. And so that was the same way with these churches. The title we put in to the Preservation Property Society, so that's what it owns, and it owns that title as what's called a bare trustee for the parishes. And so that meant that the equity is held by the Property Society for each one of the parishes. But that also meant that there had to be a process put in place so that the Property Society could know that insurance was paid annually, and that, if there are any, not taxes, but imposts that come from local government or anything, all of that had been done, that the maintenance was being kept up, and so on, so that over time the fact that the title is held by one thing and it's a trustee for something else, that in order to fulfill its obligation as a trustee, it has to know that the parishes are doing the right thing, and it has to have some way of ensuring that happens. So all of that was done by way of a memorandum of understanding that was put together, I believe, sometime in November of 2001, and which has been amended and improved and so on ever since that time. And there are a couple of people with us today who I think need to be shouted out at, with, I don't know what. One of them is John Buckle, who's been working with the Fraser Basin Property Society since it was that MOU, but for quite a while. And the other one, most importantly in my mind, is Dwight Otway, who went through the torture. Dwight is too modest about this, but the fact of the matter is we always say that this was all done by consensus, and it ultimately was. But someone had to shepherd the consensus, and sometimes someone had to be a pretty harsh shepherd to get the consensus moving where it needed to go. And that someone, unfortunately for him, was Dwight. So thank you, Dwight, for all of that, or we wouldn't be here. So that's where we got to out of the diocese. We got to APSI, we got the Fraser Basin Property Society, and then we moved along to the territory. So how did we do that? Well, over time, APSI needed to be and wanted to be less micromanaged by others who had been most supportive and helpful along our Episcopal journey as APSI. And Bishop Andrews led us into persuading the province of British Columbia and Yukon to create rules and canons that would enable the election in the traditional way of a full bishop rather than a suffragan bishop, who of course reports to another bishop. So by this time I wasn't very much involved in, or at least as fulsomely involved as I had been before, so I don't know all the details of the dates and so on of how and when that change happened, but I believe it happened sometime around 2015, and around that time we also changed our name from APSI to the territory. And I do know that the name territory was recommended by Indigenous elders at a meeting, a general meeting of APSI. I think it was in Valemont where that meeting took place, and it was adopted, and we of course now as a territory are led by Bishop Clare. And so in conclusion from all of this, and I'm canning down an awful lot of stuff, but trying my best to do it in a logical, sensible way. So in conclusion, for me, the journey from Diocese of Cariboo to Territory of the People can be summarized simply in this way. The yeast described at our Quesnel Synod now has been baked into Territory of the People. And the territory is a loaf that's evolved over 24 years into a spiritually growing community of worship, of worship communities, which continues to adhere to the three guiding principles used while we were winding up Cariboo, thus living into its and our role to reconcile amongst each community and parish across this wonderful piece of God's creation. Thank you. Yeah. Sure.
Can you hear me? Yeah, good. So, as your bishop, I want to say thank you to Canon Bud Smith. He also is humble about the depth and the commitment and the hours, the phone calls, the agonizing. I hear more and more the layers of the story, and I realize what a gift we were given by people like Bud and Dwight and John, Archbishop Crawley, Bishop Jim Cruikshank, and we name them all today, and we give thanks for their vision and their strength of character and their willingness to not give up. It's like kneading bread. We're going to stretch the metaphor a bit more, but sometimes you got to knead that dough, and it takes time until it's ready for something to happen. And that would not have happened without you, Bud. And so we are deeply, deeply grateful for that. And I thank you for taking some time today to hear and to listen. And now maybe you'll have a better understanding of why we don't call ourselves a diocese anymore, because we're not. We are absolutely not a diocese. We are incorporated under the Societies Act, and we are called a territory. Yeah. So thank you, Bud, very much.
Excuse me, I said that I would take questions if there are any, and I'm happy to do that. Might not be able to answer the questions, but I'll take them. Okay. Someone early on had asked me about what is the residential school, because there are a number of people from out of this continent, actually, who are parishioners. And I don't want to get into the minutiae of all that, because it'll take us days to learn about it. But the residential school system was developed in Canada, modeled after basically boarding schools in England, where people, and still do, go and live in a boarding school and learn whatever they do. That's where the model came from. And they initially were set up, including the one over here in Kamloops, where currently my office is located. They were set up for people who wanted to learn the techniques of agriculture, because at that time, that's okay. They were set up to help people, kids primarily, because agriculture at that time was by far the largest employer in Canada of people. So it's kind of hard to understand why people would want to go to ag school now in such numbers, but at that time it made perfect sense, because that was the major industry in Canada, was the production and the producing, preserving, and processing food was it. So those schools were set up, and initially they were not schools that you were forced to attend. They were voluntary attendance. In fact, the forced attendance didn't occur until about the 1920s. But they were set up because Indigenous leaders themselves wanted the kids to be able to learn, and so on. So that was the purpose of the original schools. But somewhere in that time, maybe from day one, there was a desire to assimilate and to take the Indian out of the Indian, as it was said, everyone who attended those schools. And they were underfunded by the government of Canada. As a kid sitting here, I remember there being knitting bees, I guess you'd call it, that would take place here or take place in people's homes every year, where people, almost exclusively women, knitted toques and scarves and mitts and socks and goodness knows what, because the school couldn't afford to buy them for the kids, because they didn't get enough money out of Ottawa to do that. So all of that was going on. But this assimilated thing was happening. And then, because I think, in part because they were underfunded, some of the teachers who came didn't come because they wanted to teach. And so sexual abuse happened at a very high level in some of those places. And Lytton, we had at least one person who was probably a pedophile. And it was because of that these lawsuits started. So that's a really canned down version of how and where residential schools come from. They started, as many things do, with a great intent by people who wanted to do good, and they somehow ended up being the opposite of what they were started out to be. Right. And rescind? That's a good question. The question was, remember I said I had gone to ask the Premier if they would use the legislature to rescind the act that created Cariboo? And Dwight has asked, is there any chance that might happen now? I'm always optimistic, and it would have to be with Bishop Clara's consent. I'd be happy to go and talk to someone down there sometime and ask them if they would do that. They might not do it again, and the reason being is because now we've got all the business going on in Richmond with the Cowichan, asserting Aboriginal title over land down there, and they may somehow. Legislators are not the most perfectly logical thinkers, and so they might worry that something else is going to get drawn into the logic of what you would be presenting to. So I don't know, but I think with time having gone by this, I'm kind of optimistic that someone would say yes, and hopefully would. But that's the only way we legally end Cariboo is in the BC legislature. Okay, well, thank you everyone for your time, and have a great day. Oh, right, yeah.